The morning air was crisp as Richard Cole strode into the gleaming glass skyscraper that housed his company's headquarters. With his tailored suit and polished shoes, he exuded authority, his presence commanding attention. He had built his career on numbers, negotiations, and an unyielding belief that power was reserved for those at the top. At the building's entrance, a black security guard stood at his post, calmly observing the steady flow of employees. He greeted them with a nod, his demeanor professional yet warm. As Richard approached, the guard extended a hand. "Good morning, sir. May I see your ID?" Richard barely glanced at him, irritation flashing across his face. He had never been asked for identification before, not here in his own company. His time was too valuable for this. "Do you even know who I am?" he snapped. His voice was sharp, laced with condescension. The guard remained composed. "It's just protocol, sir. Company policy." Richard scoffed. "You should know your place. People like you work for people like me, not the other way around." He brushed past the guard without another word, disappearing into the elevator. The lobby fell silent. A few employees who had witnessed the exchange exchanged uneasy glances. The security guard, however, remained unfazed. He simply nodded, as if confirming something to himself, and continued his work. Unbeknownst to Richard, the security guard was not just an ordinary employee. Beneath the uniform was James Carter, the chairman and majority shareholder of the company. A self-made billionaire, James had built his fortune through hard work, integrity, and an unwavering belief in treating people with dignity. That morning, he had decided to conduct an unannounced inspection, not of operations or financial reports, but of character. He wanted to see how his employees, especially those in power, treated people when they thought no one was watching. Richard had failed the test spectacularly. For the next few days, James reviewed Richard's history. He was undeniably talented, but his leadership was marred by arrogance and a lack of respect for those he deemed beneath him. Employees had long whispered about his dismissive attitude, but fear of retaliation had kept them silent. James made his decision. 3 days later, Richard was summoned to an emergency board meeting. Confident as ever, he walked in expecting another routine discussion about profits and expansion. Instead, he was met with silence and the stern gaze of the chairman. James Carter, now in his usual sharp business attire, leaned forward. "Richard, do you remember the security guard you insulted in the lobby?" Richard frowned. "What does this have to do with?" "That was me," James interrupted. "And that moment told me everything I needed to know about your leadership." Richard paled. "Sir, James raised a hand. "No excuses. Leadership is not about power. It's about respect. If you cannot treat the most essential members of this company with dignity, you have no place leading it." A heavy silence filled the room. Then, James spoke the words that sealed Richard's fate. "You're fired." Days later, as Richard packed his belongings, he reflected on his downfall. He had spent years building his empire, yet a single moment of arrogance had brought it crumbling down. Meanwhile, the employees of the company felt a renewed sense of hope. The chairman's actions sent a powerful message. Respect and integrity mattered more than titles. And as for James Carter, he continued his work, ensuring that the company was led by those who valued people, not just profits. Because true leadership is not about standing above others, it's about lifting them up. Richard Cole had always believed that success was measured in power, wealth, and control. But as he walked out of the towering headquarters for the last time, clutching the small box of his belongings, he realized he had lost something far greater than a title. He had lost respect, not only from others but from himself. The news of his dismissal spread quickly. Former colleagues whispered about his downfall, some with satisfaction, others with pity. The world of high finance was ruthless, and Richard knew that rebuilding his reputation would not be easy. Calls to old allies were met with hesitation. Doors that had once swung open for him now remained closed. For the first time in years, Richard felt powerless. Days turned into weeks. One evening, wandering through a quiet neighborhood, Richard found himself outside a small community center. Curious, he stepped inside. The room was filled with people of all backgrounds, young adults, struggling workers, and even a few former executives like himself, attending a leadership workshop. At the front of the room stood none other than James Carter, the man who had fired him. Richard hesitated, considering leaving, but something held him in place. He listened as James spoke, not about wealth or business strategies, but about humility, resilience, and the power of treating people with dignity. True leadership isn't about standing above others, James said, his gaze sweeping across the room. It's about understanding their struggles, walking in their shoes, and lifting them up. Richard felt a pang of guilt. Those words cut deeper than any financial loss. After the session, Richard approached James, expecting a cold reception. But to his surprise, James greeted him with a nod. "I didn't expect to see you here," James said, studying him carefully. "I didn't expect to be here either," Richard admitted. He hesitated, then added, "I know I messed up. I didn't respect people the way I should have. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to change." James was silent for a moment before speaking. "Change isn't about words, Richard. It's about actions. If you're serious, prove it. Not to me, but to yourself." James handed him a small card. "This center helps people rebuild, not just careers, but character. If you're willing to put in the effort, there's work to be done." Richard took the card, staring at it as if it held the weight of his future. The next morning, Richard returned. At first, the tasks were humbling: setting up chairs, assisting with workshops, and listening to people's struggles rather than controlling conversations. Slowly, he began to understand the perspectives he had once dismissed. Weeks turned into months. Richard learned to see value beyond titles, to appreciate the dignity in every job, and to rebuild his self-worth not through power, but through service. One evening, as he helped a young man prepare for a job interview, the realization struck him. This was the first time in years he felt truly fulfilled. Across the room, James watched, a small smile on his face. Maybe, just maybe, Richard Cole had finally learned what it meant to be a real leader. Months passed, and Richard Cole continued his quiet transformation. He no longer carried himself with the arrogance of a CEO, but with the humility of a man who had been given a second chance. At the community center, he spent his days mentoring young professionals, assisting job seekers, and learning from people he once would have overlooked. But despite his progress, a lingering doubt remained in his mind. Was it truly possible to rebuild a reputation once it had been shattered? One afternoon, as Richard helped a single mother prepare for an interview, she looked at him with gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to me," she said. "Most people in your position wouldn't care about someone like me." Richard hesitated before responding. "I used to be that kind of person," he admitted, "but I'm trying to change." The woman smiled. "Then you already have." Her words lingered in his mind as he left the center that evening. Maybe redemption wasn't about undoing the past, but about choosing to be better every day. One morning, James Carter approached Richard with an unexpected offer. "There's a struggling startup looking for leadership," he said. "It's not a multimillion-dollar firm, but it's an opportunity to use your skills for something meaningful." Richard hesitated. The thought of returning to the corporate world filled him with both excitement and fear. "Do you really think I deserve another shot?" he asked. James studied him carefully. "That's not for me to decide. The question is, do you believe you've earned it?" For the first time, Richard didn't answer immediately. He knew that accepting the offer meant proving, not just to others but to himself, that he had truly changed. A week later, Richard found himself standing in front of a modest office building, far from the skyscrapers he once ruled. As he walked through the doors, he saw employees who reminded him of his former self. Ambitious, driven, yet uncertain about their futures. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, not as a man seeking power, but as a leader ready to serve. For the first time in his life, Richard Cole understood that true leadership wasn't about climbing to the top. It was about lifting others along the way. And his story was far from over. Richard Cole stepped into his new role at the struggling startup, Bright Path Solutions, a small but promising company focused on sustainable technology. The office was nothing like the glass towers he once commanded. There were no private elevators, no luxury conference rooms, just a group of passionate people trying to make a difference. At first, some employees recognized his name and were hesitant to trust him. To them, he was still the ruthless CEO who had been publicly disgraced. But Richard didn't try to prove himself with words. Instead, he let his actions speak. He worked alongside his team, listening instead of commanding, mentoring instead of dictating. He stayed late to help solve problems, not because it benefited him, but because he genuinely cared. Slowly, the skepticism faded, replaced by something Richard hadn't felt in a long time: respect. One evening, as Richard was reviewing reports, a security guard walked in for the night shift. The man paused when he saw Richard and smirked. Well, the guard said. "Didn't expect to see you here, Mr. Cole." Richard looked up and immediately recognized him. It was the same security guard from his former company. Not James Carter in disguise, but the Real guard he had dismissed so rudely that fateful morning. Richard stood up. "I remember you," he said, his voice steady, "and I owe you an apology." The guard raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Oh? And why's that?" "Because I disrespected you," Richard admitted. "I was blinded by my own arrogance, and I treated you as if your role was less important than mine. But the truth is, no job is beneath another. It took me losing everything to finally understand that." The room was silent for a moment before the guard chuckled. "Well, I never expected to hear that from you." He extended a hand. "Name's Marcus, by the way." Richard shook his hand firmly. "Nice to meet you, Marcus." That handshake felt like the final step in Richard's transformation, not just an apology, but an acknowledgement of the man he used to be and the man he had become. Under Richard's leadership, Bright Path Solutions flourished. It wasn't an easy road. There were financial struggles, investor doubts, and tough decisions. But this time, Richard faced them not as a ruthless CEO, but as a leader who valued his people. Months later, James Carter visited the office, impressed by the progress. "I see you found your purpose," he said, watching the way employees respected Richard. "Not out of fear, but out of trust." "I finally understand what you tried to teach me," Richard replied. "Success isn't about power or wealth. It's about impact, about how you treat people when no one is watching." James nodded approvingly. "Then I'd say you've truly learned what it means to be a leader." Richard's story wasn't one of overnight redemption, nor was it a simple fall and rise. It was a journey of learning, unlearning, and becoming someone better, not for status, but for himself. And as he looked around at the people he now worked with, people he respected and who respected him in return, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he was truly successful. Not because he was at the top, but because he had finally learned to lift others along the way.